Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We are just thrilled that you're with us today. My name is Marilee McFarland and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni and Field Relations here at Principia. And we are just filled with gratitude for each one of you. We've loved reading what you are sharing in the chat box about what you're grateful for, and we echo so much of that. It's fun to see people from coast to coast and also around the world joining us. The music you were listening to as you joined is from the Principia College Orchestra performing What a Wonderful World, which was part of last year's virtual Christmas concert, and such a perfect song to launch us today. Now, to get in the spirit of Thanksgiving, aside from that gratitude, let's take a quick poll and find out what is your favorite Thanksgiving side dish. So I'm going to launch it. I know we haven't captured everything, so if you have a favorite that we haven't listed here, feel free to enter that in the chat box too. We've included a few that may have appeared at the first Thanksgiving 400 years ago. So we'll give you just a few minutes, about 30 seconds more to enter into the chat box. To take the poll about what is your favorite Thanksgiving side dish. Oh gosh, it looks like, and is anybody entering into the chat what their favorite is outside? Oh, sweet potatoes with marshmallows. That was definitely a favorite. We did this morning in our team meeting. So, all right, well, I'm going to end the poll and we'll share the results. So it looks like cranberries beat out dressing just by a hair, and followed by mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and curd fritters. So, well, thank you all so much for taking that poll, and it's fun to see what you love and what you will be enjoying in just about a week. We're grateful that you've joined us for this timely talk with Dr. Kate Swanson. As we celebrate the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, Dr. Swanson will dig into the history of Thanksgiving with a specific focus on the Pilgrim Wampanoag gathering and the roles of these two different cultures. You're in for a real feast today. Before I turn the screen over, I want to share about a couple of upcoming events. Thanksgiving may have a tradition of football, but this year, as we enter into the Thanksgiving holiday, Principia is all about rugby. The Principia College rugby team, the Thunder Chickens, won the conference championship 2 weeks ago and is continuing on to the Sweet 16 of the Division II Rugby National Championships, competing in 15s. Their first game as part of the Sweet 16 is going to be played this Friday, November 19th at noon in Forest Park here in St. Louis. And if you can't make it in person to the game will also be live streamed. So we look forward to having you cheer on our Thunder Chickens. You're also invited to join us for a special pre-game virtual event with former and current Thunder Chicken coaches and players this Thursday, November 18th at 7 p.m. as part of the Golden Blue Principia All-American Series. You're going to hear from the founding father of Principia College Rugby, as well as current players and coaches, and it will be fun to hear about their road to the national championships. We hope that you'll wear your gold and blue and cheer on the Thunder Chickens. We'll post the link in the chat box for you to register for the virtual event on Thursday, and be sure to visit the Alumni and College Facebook pages and Instagram pages for the live streaming links for the games. Those will be posted towards the end of this week. And after you've enjoyed your Thanksgiving dinner, we hope that you will be a part of the fun on Tuesday, November 30th as Giving Tuesday. We invite you to donate to Principia on this global day of giving. There are a variety of opportunities to give to specific projects and matches for your donation. So we hope that you will join us in supporting Principia on Giving Tuesday. And finally, after we have Thanksgiving and Giving Tuesday, then we hit December. And we hope that you will put on your holiday apparel for all of the Principia Christmas festivities, from traditional Christmas and caroling parties to Christmas concerts, a fa la 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 family sing-along, and we're even doing some karaoke and trivia. There is a full calendar of virtual events, as well as a few in-person Christmasings hosted around the country by Principia clubs. So you can learn about all of these upcoming events at principia.edu/events, and we can't wait to see you. I would now like to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. Kate Swanson is an assistant professor of history at Principia College, who teaches a wide variety of courses on topics including Latin American and global history, pirates, the Indigenous Americas, and material culture, which is the study of stuff. Prior to joining the faculty at Principia College, she served as the curator of collections at Plymouth Patuxent, formerly Plymouth Plantation, a living history museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts, dedicated to the study and interpretation of the 17th century Atlantic world. Dr. Swanson earned a PhD in history archaeology from Boston University, and she is the author of Setting the Table, Ceramics, Dining, and Cultural Exchange. We are so grateful that she is here today to set the table for us as we look at the history of this beloved Thanksgiving tradition. Following her talk today, there will be time for questions. So we invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A box, which should appear at the top or bottom of your screen throughout the talk. Today's talk is being recorded and will be posted in the next couple of days on our virtual events webpage, where you can also find recordings of all of the concerts and talks over the last 18 months. And we'll post that link in the chat box as well. We are so grateful to Dr. Swanson for sharing with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Helps if I unmute. Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction and for everyone joining us. I've seen a few familiar names in the chat box, and that's great to hear. So today we're going to be exploring the long history of Thanksgiving in the United States. The modern history of this holiday was inspired by an event that happened 400 years ago in what is today New England, between people known as the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. This, however, is not the first time that communities had assembled to give thanks. So today, we'll explore the events leading up to this historic gathering and the celebration itself. We'll then look at how this event fits into the bigger picture of traditions of giving thanks in the United States and its influence on our modern holiday. To get us in the mood, let's start with a hymn. This is a recent addition to the Christian Science hymnals, but it comes from a 17th century Dutch melody, and we have a variation of 17th century English lyrics. Our college organist, Dr. Rose Whitmore, and music professor Wendy Reynolds have recorded it for us to hear today. We'll also have the words up on the screen in case you'd like to sing along at home. So here we go with hymn 593. Thank you, Rose and Wendy. Now that we're all hopefully feeling ready for this American national holiday, let's explore the history of it. If you are from the United States or you've spent time in the US, then you probably know the often cited story of Thanksgiving. For the majority of us, it goes something like this. In 1620, a group of people called the Pilgrims landed in New England because they wanted the freedom to practice their own religion, which was something they were not easily able to do in Europe. They were so grateful to be here that they threw a big feast and invited the native people in the area, known as the Wampanoags, to join them. These two people sat together in harmony and ate their meal. The story often ends here. It frequently ignores both the historical nuances of the event and the impact that the Wampanoags had on the occasion. In recent years, many have begun to question this traditional story and are bothered by the overtones of colonization and imperialism. This viewpoint is especially prevalent among some native communities, like the Wampanoag, who sometimes commemorate a national day of mourning instead of a day of Thanksgiving in November. These different viewpoints are valid and are worth acknowledging, but the idea of focusing on gratitude and giving thanks has a long history in both the European and native traditions, and this is what I'd like us to focus on today. For me, this is the essence of Thanksgiving. It's a time to focus on the present good in our experiences and to be grateful for it. This is why Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. So let's dive into the origins of this holiday and look more closely at the traditions of gratitude and the 400-year-old event that sparked a modern national holiday. Most tellings of the Thanksgiving story begin with the Pilgrims, but we're going to travel a little further back in time and start with the Wampanoag. Both their oral histories and their archaeological record indicate that these people have lived in New England for close to 10,000 years. Around 700 CE or AD, they began practicing agriculture. At this point, they were what scholars call a semi-sedentary society, which means they practiced some agriculture and grew some plants, but they also moved around depending on the season. Now we're going to be talking about the different events you see here on the timeline, with the focus on the ones that happened towards the end. So we'll get into all of that in the next few minutes. In the winters, the Wampanoag typically lived a few miles inland from the coast, and they hunted wild animals like deer and fowl. In the summers, they moved to the coast and grew crops like corn, tobacco, and beans, while also taking advantage of the rich fishing and hunting along the shores. They had and continue to have a deep spiritual tradition that includes a strong sense of gratitude and the importance of giving thanks. For them, this was a constant process and way of life. Expressing gratitude was not limited to a specific season or annual event. Their first contact with the Europeans actually happened close to 100 years before the Pilgrims arrived in the early 1500s. These newcomers were traders, and they were there to get items like furs and fish that they could sell in Europe for a profit. For the most part, they were men, and they did not intend to stay in the area. So the interactions with native peoples were fairly sporadic and short-lived, albeit sometimes violent. This map, by the way, was created by Captain John Smith of Virginia fame in 1616. So this shows that they were very familiar with the terrain of New England prior to the Pilgrims arriving. One incident which angered and scared the Wampanoag people happened in 1614, when English Captain Thomas Hunt captured 27 native men and sold them as slaves in Malaga, Spain. While we don't know the fate of most of these men, one of them becomes a key player in our story. Tisquantum, who's also sometimes known as Squanto, was among those captured. Through a series of events, he made his way to London, where he learned English and served as an interpreter and guide for other traders. The whole time, he was obviously hoping to return to his native village of Patuxent. Now, remember these names, Tisquantum and Patuxent. We'll be coming back to them soon. Tisquantum achieved his goal of returning home in 1619, 5 years after being captured. When he arrived, he found that a plague had killed nearly everyone in his village. We do not know exactly what the plague was. There's been extensive studies that indicate it probably was not smallpox that hit other parts of the Americas. But we do know that it killed between 75 and 90% of the population that was between present-day Maine and Rhode Island. For the Wampanoag, who live in present-day Massachusetts, it was particularly devastating. The combination of anger at Europeans for capturing their people and stress caused by the plague resulted in increased violence between the Europeans and native communities. One such conflict actually resulted in Tisquantum's freedom. His captor was mortally injured and the ship that he was on fled to the Virginia colony of Jamestown for assistance. Free from the English, Tisquantum had no village to return to, and his homeland was under the authority of a new sachem or leader called Usamequin. Now, Usamequin is also called Massasoit sometimes. Massasoit is actually his title. So we're going to stick to his given name, Usamequin, today. Usamequin lived in Pokanoket, which is roughly 40 miles west of Patuxent, and he recognized that the bilingual Tisquantum could be a valuable asset in future dealings with the English. At this point, we have to speculate on a few things. It's unclear if Tisquantum was a captive of Usamequin, or if he joined his community because Patuxent was decimated. Likewise, we don't know just how loyal Tisquantum was to Usamequin and his people. For now, keep in mind that among modern historians, Tisquantum has a bit of a reputation. He was known to manipulate situations that he encountered and turn them to his advantage. While all of these events were unfolding for the Wampanoag, there was a small group of people across the Atlantic in England who were being persecuted because they practiced Christianity differently than the Church of England. In an effort to find a place to worship in a way they deemed appropriate, many of them fled to Holland and set up a church and community in Leiden. After nearly a decade there, several of the members felt that it was time to find a new place, one where they could worship and live as they liked, without the threat of changing European politics and foreign cultural influences. They had a few places to choose from, but they decided on North America. To pay for their voyage, they found investors and included individuals who were not part of their faith community, but wanted and could afford to come. They hired 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, and they started out in mid-August of 1620. Now, if you're anything like me and my family, you have to return home at least once when you set off on a trip because you forgot something or you had to check on something or for whatever reason you needed to go back. The Pilgrims were no different. They had a few false starts that led to a 3-week delay. Ultimately, they had to abandon the Speedwell, and they finally left just in the Mayflower from Plymouth, England, and headed west across the Atlantic on September 6th, 1620. They spent the next 65 days in the ship. For the most part, they were in an enclosed space called the 'tween decks that was a stuffy, cramped, and undoubtedly quite smelly area. There were 102 passengers, at least 2 dogs, and probably animals like goats and chickens that could have been part of the provisions. These passengers included single men and women, married couples, children, and 2 pregnant women. One of them gave birth on the voyage, and the other gave birth shortly after arrival. Each family also brought the clothes, food, furniture, tools, and other supplies that they envisioned needing for at least a year. They thought that it would be at least that long before they could get more goods from England. You can see in these pictures We've got a pile of items on an exhibit that shows roughly some of the things they would have brought. And then the image on the right shows a few modern employees at Plymouth Patuxent standing in the 'tween decks of a replica ship, and they're loading a barrel into the hold. You can see how dark and close that area is. Also aboard this ship was another ship. They had broken it into pieces, and the plan was that they would reassemble it when they got to America, and they would use it to catch cod, which they planned to send back to England as a means of refunding their investors and supporting themselves. Now, the Mayflower is about 100 feet long. To give you some perspective, that's about the length of 2 full-sized school buses. So this is a pretty small ship for all of these people, animals, and items. It was also not in the best condition. This round trip to America was to be its last voyage, as it was sold for scrap shortly after returning to England. To give you a little bit of perspective, the picture you see here is a replica of the Mayflower called the Mayflower II that's owned by Plymouth Patuxent, the Living History Museum Marilee mentioned. When I was the curator of collections at Plymouth, this replica ship was undergoing a series of major repairs. It was necessary for her preservation, but it was also something that the US Coast Guard required in order for the museum to sail her. In other words, they deemed her unworthy of being at sea in the condition she was prior to the repairs. Now, we don't know for sure what the original Mayflower looked like or exactly what her condition was, but I imagine that it might have been in a similar condition to the Mayflower II when it left Plymouth, England in 1620. I mention this tidbit to give you a sense both of what the trip was like and how strongly these people believed in what they were doing. They were risking their lives and their families in a fairly old, most likely beat up ship in order to set up a home in a new land. I also want to pause a minute here and emphasize that not everyone who came over on the Mayflower was part of that faith community. So from the get-go, they were aware of the importance of finding ways to coexist with others who had different values and concepts of religion. Regardless of their motives for crossing the Atlantic, they finally saw land, which you can see here. This is First Encounter Beach on Cape Cod. Their first sighting was on Thursday, November 9th, 1620. Can you imagine their relief and gratitude at arriving? They'd been cooped up in a small space with almost 100 other people and animals, no way of doing laundry, minimal exercise, and little variety of activity. The reenactors here are actually reconstructing the first thing they did when the Pilgrims arrived, which was to do laundry. Just think how hard it would have been to entertain the children on that ship for that long, let alone the adults. Like other European arrivals in St. Augustine, Florida, or Jamestown, Virginia, the Pilgrims most likely had some formal acknowledgement of their gratitude when they landed. Perhaps they sang a hymn like the one we heard or listened to a few minutes ago. The land they saw was, as I mentioned, on Cape Cod, which you can see on the bottom of this image. This wasn't quite where they expected to be, but they had to stay there because winter was approaching and they had dwindling supplies at this point. A group of men disembarked and went to explore the area to try and decide where exactly they wanted to settle. While they were ashore, they had a few brief encounters and tense sightings of the Wampanoag people, but they never got close enough to communicate or trade. After nearly a month of exploring, the Pilgrims decided to settle on an area that had a bay deep enough for large ocean-going ships, a source of fresh water, and a large amount of cleared land where they could build their homes. What they didn't know was that this area was Patuxent, the former home of Tisquantum, and an area that was under the authority of Usamequin. You can see, just to give you a sense of the geography, here's Cape Cod down on the bottom of this image, if you can see my mouse, and then Plymouth is just across the bay, right here. It was now December for the Pilgrims, and as I can tell you from personal experience, you definitely want to have a house or some form of shelter if you're in New England in December. So they quickly set to work building homes and a common storehouse. They ultimately built several structures, but nearly half of the group died before the spring. The high mortality rate, the stress of building a settlement in an unforgiving winter climate, and the constant fear of potential native attacks made for a particularly challenging first winter. Throughout this time, the Wampanoag had been watching the newcomers and debating what to do. They might have seen a view similar to this one. Unlike the traders that the Wampanoag were used to encountering, these people were building structures and appeared intent on staying. They also had women and children. And this was significant to the Wampanoag, as it meant to them that these newcomers were not here to make war. On March 16th, 1621, a native man walked up to those who had survived the winter and said, in English, "Welcome." As you can imagine, they were shocked. This man, who later introduced himself as Samoset, was from present-day Maine and had learned some English from the different Europeans he'd encountered on the coast. Samoset then went to Osamequin's headquarters and got to Squantum, who would be the translator for the Pilgrims for more than a year. Shortly thereafter, Osamequin arrived, and he brought his wives and children along with men from his community. And again, it's significant that he brought his wives and children because that signified that it was a peaceful encounter. The two people established an alliance and agreed to a treaty that outlined the terms of their partnership. For the Pilgrims, they gained the protection and guidance of Osamequin and his people. For the Wampanoag, they secured the Pilgrims and their weapons as allies. This was particularly important for the Wampanoag. Their population had been weakened because of the plague, yet their ancient enemies, the Narragansetts, who live in what is today Rhode Island, had not been impacted by the plague. So it was a step towards resettling the power balance in the area. Over the next few months, the Pilgrims and Wampanoag had frequent interactions. The newcomers learned the native practice of planting a herring with their seeds in order to fertilize the rocky soil, as well as native strategies for catching local fish and eels. The archaeological evidence indicates that the Pilgrims also relied on their Wampanoag neighbors for goods, such as pottery for cooking and dining, and potentially skins and other clothing items. After a stressful voyage and a devastating winter, things finally seemed to be improving for the Pilgrims. Sometime in the late fall of 1621, probably between late September and early November, the Pilgrims harvested their fields and realized that they had enough food to survive the winter. This was indeed cause for major celebrations. Mayflower passenger Edward Winslow described their joy and gratitude in a letter that he sent back to England shortly after the festivities. He wrote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might, after a special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And though it be not always so plentiful with us as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." This brief description is the earliest and most thorough account that we have of that historic event. In the original text, this passage is part of one very long paragraph that describes all the news from the fledgling settlement. The fact that it is part of a recounting of other events suggests to me that Winslow and the other participants had no idea that their activities would prove to be so historically significant. It's actually likely Winslow never intended for this letter to be published. As short as the account is, we can unpack it quite a bit and tease out some more information, including details that Winslow himself might not have known he was recording for posterity. As we dig into the passage in the next few minutes, it's important to remember that we do not have a similar eyewitness account from the Wampanoag perspective. That said, it is possible to read between the lines and see the significant role that the Wampanoag played, both in this event and in making it possible. So, like Winslow, let's start with the harvest. That's the cause for this celebration, after all. For hundreds of years, English men and women celebrated successful harvests with feasts, festivals, dances, games, and local customs. The Pilgrims might not have partaken in all of these activities, but the idea of marking the end of a fruitful harvest was a familiar concept to them. Days of thanksgiving and praise, like this one, were one of only 3 types of holidays that the Pilgrims allowed themselves. The other 2 holidays were the Sabbath and days of fasting and humiliation, which to them was a fitting repentance for unfortunate events. Like the Wampanoag, giving gratitude was a regular occurrence for the Pilgrims. It was their way of celebrating something good, and it was not just a once-a-year occasion. This harvest that they were celebrating was most likely American flint corn, which Swanson had taught them how to plant in the local soil. The Pilgrims also brought seeds and English foods to try and grow in their new home, but these didn't always take very easily to American soil and climate. Elsewhere in his letter, Winslow notes that they tried to plant barley, which yielded a so-so crop, and peas, which he deemed very unsuccessful. They might have also had beans and squashes, such as pumpkin, as well as native plants like Jerusalem artichoke, wild onion, garlic, cranberries, watercress, walnuts, chestnuts, and Concord grapes. Let me emphasize here that Swanson and perhaps other Native individuals played an essential role in helping the Pilgrims learn how to plant a successful harvest in this new environment. Without their help, the Pilgrims probably would not have been organizing a Thanksgiving feast. It's likely that the very seeds they planted came from Wampanoag stores that the Pilgrims found while they were exploring Cape Cod shortly after their arrival. Realizing that they had cause for celebration, the then governor of the settlement, William Bradford, sent 4 men to go hunt wild birds so that they could have a feast as a community. These 4 men managed to kill almost enough birds to feed the whole settlement for nearly a week. Winslow doesn't state exactly what kinds of birds they brought back, but we can make a few educated guesses. They might have caught some migratory ducks and geese, potentially smaller birds like quail and the passenger pigeon, which is now extinct, and of course, wild turkey. You can see in the picture on the left, there's some turkeys through the trees. So these 4 men might have seen an image like this as they were out hunting. Keep in mind too that they lived right by the coast. Winslow talks about a little help beside, and that could mean seafood. Mussels, lobster, and eel would have all been available throughout the fall and might have made an appearance at this event. Now that they were confident they had enough food for their feast, they began to party. Winslow doesn't give much detail about the specific activities other than eating, but he does say, among other recreations, we exercised our arms. In other words, they had fun and shot their weapons into the air. They might have also done some singing, like you see the group of Pilgrim reenactors here, and potentially played marbles. You can see an archaeological marble on the bottom there with a penny in the picture for scale. At this point, the Wampanoag arrive. Now, we don't know the exact circumstances of their arrival. As allies, they might have been specifically invited. They could have also heard the Pilgrims shooting their weapons and wanted to investigate. A third option could be that they came as a way of reinforcing their alliance with the Pilgrims and showing their enemies that they were connected with these newcomers who had these new kinds of weapons. Now, keep in mind, the Wampanoag were frequent visitors to the settlement. Some of them even lived right outside the fledgling community. So they were not necessarily strangers or even unfamiliar guests. What was perhaps unusual at this event is the fact that Usamiquin, or Massasoit, as Winslow calls him, came, and he brought with him at least 90 men. Winslow doesn't specify whether or not women and children also came, but even without them, this is a large group. There were probably only about 50 Europeans at this point. So the Wampanoag actually outnumbered the Pilgrims by close to 2-to-1 at this gathering. According to that firsthand account, everyone spent 3 days enjoying themselves and feasting. As mentioned before, we don't have much detail about their exact activities, but we can speculate a little bit. As one might expect, the Pilgrims would have offered a prayer of gratitude before and after every meal. So acknowledging God and giving thanks would have been a key component of the festival for the Pilgrims. They might have also, as I mentioned before, sung hymns or played games like marbles. Some popular Wampanoag entertainments might have included similar songs and expressions of gratitude, as well as their own games. They had a type of football game, for example, that could have made an appearance. According to a Wampanoag friend of mine, some modern Wampanoag men were playing it at Plymouth Patuxent several years ago, and a few pro NFL players were watching. The Wampanoag men invited these pro football players to join, but they declined because they felt that it looked too violent and rough for them. I can only imagine. During these 3 days of camaraderie, the two groups of people might not have been able to communicate much with each other. They had been allies for nearly 6 months, but we don't know how much they could actually speak to each other without interpreters like Tisquantum. Perhaps some individuals spoke or could understand more than others, but as we envision this gathering, remember that there was undoubtedly quite a bit of sign language and guessing that was also going on. Winslow continues his description of the celebration by saying that the Wampanoag went out and killed 5 deer that they brought back and gave to Governor Bradford, Captain Miles Standish, and others. I want to pause on this point for a few minutes. It has some significance that isn't often recognized, especially when we think about the potential flaws in communication. Deer abound in New England, much as they do in southern Illinois. This animal was essential to the Wampanoag way of life. Deer provided meat for eating, skins for clothing and blankets, bone and antler for tools and toys. Just in this picture, you can see these women, they're wearing a variety of skins, but mostly deer. There's a deer skin on the log behind them, a toy that's made predominantly of deer skin, and a bag on the ground that would have been also made of deer skin. Deer would have been both familiar and important to the average Wampanoag individual. To the English, deer meat or venison was considered an extremely rare luxury. It was illegal to buy or sell it in England, and deer were typically only found on the property of landed gentry. Consequently, the Pilgrims saw venison as something that was only enjoyed by the very wealthy on very special occasions. To them, it was a sign of civility, wealth, and perhaps power. As you can see, deer had 2 very different meanings in these 2 cultures. For Usamiquin and his people, presenting deer could have been a means of sharing something that was important and useful to their people. For the Pilgrims, they would have interpreted this gesture as an indication of the civility and culture of their Wampanoag allies. Tisquantum, who had lived for England in a time, most likely understood both meanings. Now, do you remember how I said he had a knack and a reputation for taking advantage and manipulating situations? I wonder if, in this particular instance, Tisquantum told Usamiquin to get deer and present it to the most influential Pilgrims at the end of the festivities. By doing so, he would have ensured that the Pilgrims were adequately impressed with his people and convinced that they were worthy allies despite their cultural differences. The Pilgrims' appreciation of the gift of deer, in turn, could have been seen by the Wampanoag as an indication that they recognized the importance of deer and its usefulness. If this was Tisquantum's influence and strategy, it seemed to have worked. Winslow, who probably didn't fully understand all the subtle nuances of the exchange, was impressed enough to mention deer specifically. I want to emphasize that. It's the only food that's mentioned by name in the entire paragraph. The two peoples parted ways after this exchange, and they were satisfied with each other, willing to maintain an alliance that was to last another 50 years before a second generation of Europeans in Wampanoag found themselves fighting each other in King Philip's War. Winslow concludes this portion of his letter to tell his reader that even though they didn't always have such bounty, God had blessed them, and they wished that they could share their plenty with those in England. We have no evidence to suggest that this feast was ever repeated, or even that they planned for it to be important. Whatever the intentions of those participants in 1621, this event became the inspiration for the modern holiday in the United States. As I've mentioned already, this gathering was not the first time that communities in North America had gathered to give thanks. Throughout the US, many Native peoples have elements of gratitude in their creation stories, as well as special events to celebrate and mark important moments in planting, harvesting, and seasons. The images here show the green corn dance, as well as a snowshoe dance celebrating the first snowfall. Ethnographers working in the with the Salish-speaking people in Western Montana documented a special Thanksgiving dance and ceremony related to planting crops. So this is a widespread tradition. The plethora of Europeans who came to North America also celebrated their blessings prior to 1621. Scholars speculate that as early as 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon gave thanks for a safe passage when he arrived in Florida. We know that both French and Spanish settlers sang hymns of thanks, celebrated Mass, and feasted when they began to set up their own colonies in what is today northern Florida in 1564 and 1565. Even other English colonists gathered for Thanksgiving celebrations before the Pilgrims. In 1619, a group proclaimed an annual Thanksgiving celebration to mark the establishment of Berkeley's 100 in Virginia. The various expressions of gratitude gradually coalesced into the holiday we know today. Since 1717, and you can see an image here from 1717, various governing bodies and officials have declared national Thanksgivings. It was not until 1863, however, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the first federal Thanksgiving proclamation, and that's a tradition that continues today. In the late 1920s, shortly after the Great Depression, the fourth Thursday of November was legally set as the official Thanksgiving Day in the United States. More recently, people have begun to question traditional interpretations of this holiday and how it's so closely linked to the Pilgrim Wampanoag gathering. In 1970, for example, a Wampanoag man named Frank James called for a day of mourning instead of Thanksgiving. He argued that people needed to recognize the seismic shift that Native people experienced with the arrival of the Pilgrims, or Europeans in general. And he wanted to contrast the Native perception of Pilgrims with the image of the glorified pilgrim that is often depicted in Thanksgiving imagery. Other Native individuals, including some Wampanoag people, continue to maintain a tradition of giving thanks regularly throughout the year. Now, no discussion of this topic is complete without a picture of Plymouth Rock. As we approach the 400th anniversary of the historic Pilgrim Wampanoag gathering this year, it's worth remembering a few things. Over the intervening centuries, the story of this historic event has sometimes become inflated to glorify the European pilgrim. The event's meaning has changed, become simplified, and for some morphed into an excuse to take time off of work, eat turkey, and watch football. For others, it is a deeply personal day of honoring ancestors, spending time with the family, praying, and giving thanks. Those present at the original event most likely had no intention or even idea that their 3-day feast would evolve into a national holiday. For them, it was a continuation of long-standing traditions of giving thanks for blessings received. Both communities had faced hardship. They were grateful for immediate blessings, being alive, having enough food for the winter, having allies during what seemed to be a particularly dangerous time. They might have spoken different languages, celebrated in different ways, and even had different concepts of what deer meant. But they were able to combine their expressions of gratitude into a moment of harmony and joy that is still recognized 4 centuries later. So this year, as you make your Thanksgiving preparations and hopefully enjoy November 25th, remember that by being grateful for the blessings you have in your experience right now, you are tapping into a deep tradition of giving thanks. You are connecting with the many different cultures of gratitude that make up the US, including the English, Pilgrims, Wampanoag, French, Spanish, and Salish. I'm thankful for all that these different people have contributed, for the example they set for us in reminding us to acknowledge and celebrate our present good. And I'm also very thankful for everyone who helped make this talk possible. And Marilee, I think we have time for questions.
Great. Well, we invite everyone to enter any questions that you have in the chat box. We have received a few comments about books that people have really enjoyed reading, including Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer and 1491. Are there any books that you really recommend if we want to learn more about this or kind of dive into this topic?
Sure. Well, as any of my students or colleagues know, I'm a huge fan of primary sources. So the original text is from a book called Mort's Relations. And there's lots of different versions of it, transcriptions mainly. But I highly recommend that. It's very short. In terms of secondary sources, some good historical references are Nathaniel Philbrick's book, The Mayflower. This is, I think it was written in the early 2000s, and it's a pretty good account. He tries to include the different perspectives. Another more recent one is David Silverman's book, This Land Was Their Land. And that is telling this story more from the Wampanoag perspective. And both of those authors actually go beyond Thanksgiving up into King Philip's War, and Silverman extends it into some modern day Wampanoag experiences. So I highly recommend all of those, as well as there's other primary sources about Plymouth. Governor William Bradford wrote his famous book of Plymouth Plantation, which is his history. That's kind of the main historical account that we have. Some others include 3 Visitors to Plymouth, which are letters from 3 people that don't live in Plymouth, but they visit. And then we have Good News from New England, which is also by Edward Winslow.
That's great. Lots of excellent resources. So, and sorry, I didn't capture all of them to put in the chat box, but we can include those in the follow-up email with the recording. Is there any estimate to the monetary value of the 1621 feast?
I don't know of any studies that have looked at that. They were, harvesting things that they had grown and catching things that were wild. So I don't know that people have actually sat down and tried to figure out the grocery bill. We also don't know exactly how much they had. He's very vague in terms of how many birds they got. The little help beside, it could have been all lobster, it could have been all eel, it could have been a mix of things. And it could have been terrestrial animals, not just seafood. So there isn't really enough detail to fully know exactly how much things would have cost now or then. Sorry, I don't have that information.
No, thank you. Do you have a sense of where the seeds for growing tobacco and corn used by the Wampanoags came from? Were they growing wild in the area? What's the history and background on that?
So the Wampanoag, their agriculture practice developed over time. So much like we see in other areas, these seeds are probably things that they've kind of helped natural selection along. So they might have noticed that one particular strand of corn grows juicier kernels and bigger ears. And so they might have planted that more and kind of helped nature direct a course. I don't know exactly the specifics of where they got their seeds. For the Pilgrims, when they arrive in Cape Cod, they're wandering around and they encounter some structures that to them look abandoned. And in some of the structures, they have these pits that have corn in them. And so the Pilgrims don't understand that the Wampanoag, that's their summer settlement, and they're going to come back. So they take some of the corn. They later try to pay them back. They have some beads and things that they try to give back to the Wampanoag. And for many modern Wampanoag, this is a point that they're not happy about, which makes sense. People just went into your summer house and took your food. But it was kind of a cultural misunderstanding, I think, when you look at the texts. So the Pilgrims probably got a lot of the seeds from the Wampanoag. And people like to Swanson. There was another man that lived just outside of the settlement named Hobbamock. And he was kind of established there probably by Usamiquin, who wanted someone close to the Pilgrims to either help or kind of report on them. So there are a lot of native influences going on in this first year that are probably giving some seeds and helping people figure out how to plant and how to grow in this new area.
Thank you. When and why did they change the name from Plymouth Plantation to Plymouth Patuxent?
This happened either 2019 or 2020. It was an official change. It's something they talked about for a long time. And there were several different reasons. Plymouth Plantation was the historic name for it that William Bradford gives in the 1640s when he writes his book. Today, plantations have a different connotation. For 1620 New Englanders, it was basically a word for settlement. Plantation, hundred, colony, these were all kind of similar terms that they used. So that's the initial reason for naming the museum Plymouth Plantation. They changed it to Plymouth Patuxent, both because of the modern connotations, but also this better reflects the two cultures that they actively interpret and demonstrate there. So Patuxent being the Wampanoag name for that area. It was an attempt to recognize and honor the Wampanoag heritage, just in the name of the museum, as well as in the stories that they tell through the interpretations.
Great, thank you. I'm going to end with this final question as we go into Thanksgiving. If any of us want to do some cooking of something that may have been fixed 400 years ago, are there any good cookbooks or resources that you would recommend people look into?
That is a great question. I'm actually teaching a course right now on food history. So unfortunately, that's Spanish food history, so slightly different cookbooks. There are some recipes available on Plymouth Patuxent's website. And there's a link in the chat box. Thank you, Marilee. Those are both Wampanoag and Pilgrim recipes. I think they have 4 or 5 up. There are a few other cookbooks that I think they reference in this link. And I'm blanking on the top of my head exactly what the names are. I will say if you're looking at early cookbooks, they're very vague by modern standards. So you'll see things like a handful of flour and a dash of nutmeg and stir it until it feels like boiled bread. And so there's a lot of expectation that the reader knows both the terms and the amounts. They're also practicing a technique called down hearth cooking that essentially you have a fire and you're cooking, and in order to get things colder, you move it away from the fire. To get it hotter, you move it closer. A lot of the historic pots have legs that you would put coals underneath, and that's your burner if you think of a stove. So they don't have exact temperatures. So you're not going to see a recipe that says, 500 milligrams of this, 3 cups of that, heat at 350 in an oven for 20 minutes. It's all very vague. So some of these recipes, they've taken historic recipes and transcribed them to modern terms that cooks would understand. Others you kind of have to experiment and guess with. I will say I made curd fritters, which is on the link. And that is a fun guessing game. I don't know if I did it right, but it was edible. So I'm guessing that I made it somewhat close to what they might have done.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. And we will include all of these links in the follow-up email with the recording. I know there has been some changes with Zoom where you can't copy and paste from the chat box. And so that's a new security feature on Zoom. So someone just asked why they can't copy from the chat box, and that is why. So, but we'll include all of those links in the follow-up emails. Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson, for speaking with us today. And on behalf of the entire Alumni and Field Relations team, thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Kate will be giving this talk tonight at 7:30 p.m. The event will be both online and in person at Wanamaker Hall at Principia College. So if you're in the Elsa area, you're invited to join us at Wanamaker Hall, or please share the link so people can tune in, and anyone is invited to tune in tonight. Again, the recording of this talk will be posted in the next couple of days on our virtual events webpage, and we will also be sending out an email. We hope that you will join us for our upcoming virtual events, including cheering on that rugby team, learn more about rugby and the history of why they are called the Thunder Chickens. I know some people were asking that earlier, so that will be, they will share that on Thursday night as part of the Gold and Blue All-American series, and then cheer on the team in person at Forest Park or online at noon on Friday Central Time. And then in December, we look forward to jingling and mingling with you as part of all of the Christmas festivities. So you can learn more at principia.edu/events. So it is just with hearts filled with gratitude that we wish all of you a very happy Thanksgiving. Bye.